Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending where you're joining us from. We will get started in just a moment. Welcome, everyone. For those of you just joining us, we'll get started in just a moment. Good afternoon, good morning. We're happy you're with us.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Nick Tedesco, and I'm the President and CEO of the National Center for Family Philanthropy. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on financial stewardship. We're grateful to present this webinar in partnership with the Council on Foundations. We appreciate their collaboration and thought leadership in the field. The question of private foundation payout has been a frequent topic of conversation in the boardrooms in recent months. Many founders are grappling with how much to spend in this moment and how it aligns with their ultimate purpose. Many families are struggling with how to meet the rising needs of the communities they seek to serve, while keeping in mind the health of their endowments, the mission of their organizations, and plans for perpetuity. Many funders have decided to increase their spending, while others have opted to remain consistent. This conversation is not meant to promote spending down or perpetuity, spending more or maintaining 5%. Instead, we're asking you to reflect and wrestle with finding a balance between your payout, your mission, your lifespan, and current conditions. As both NCFP and the Council have fielded questions in the last few months about spending in times of uncertainty, we recognize the need to move beyond a binary approach to payout. Accordingly, we commissioned Tony Macklin to explore a new framework, one that puts into consideration a number of factors mentioned above. The end result of this exploration is the recently released publication, Balancing Purpose, Payout, and Permanence. For those interested, see the GoToWebinar panel to download a copy of the guide. Today, we're also releasing the discussion guide to complement this broader publication. We hope this conversation and the two publications will be helpful tools as you revisit payout. The decision rests with you, your family, your board, and your staff, and without judgment. Before I introduce our moderator, let me briefly share about our webinar technology. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and a replay will be made available to all attendees. If you experience any technical issues, please reconnect to the technology or email webinars@cof.org. If our entire call drops, please log back in and be patient while we restart the conversation. You're welcome to chat with us on Twitter about today's webinar using the hashtag NCFPWeb and the handles @familygiving and COF_. And please remember to take a brief post-event survey at the end of the session. We want this webinar to be interactive, so please submit questions for the panelists. To ask a question, please use the question box on the current slide. When sending in a question, if you wish to remain anonymous, please indicate that. Now on to the programming. Our moderator for today's webinar is Tony Macklin. Tony is a philanthropic advisor that consults with donor families, grant makers, and their advisors about purpose, use of resources, action planning, and learning. Tony previously served as the executive director of the Roy A. Hunt Foundation and spent 12 years with the Central Indiana Community Foundation. Tony is also an NCFP senior program consultant. And Tony, we're thrilled to have you join us. So thank you for facilitating the conversation today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Nick, thanks for the introduction and for having me on. We'll bring you back in some of the Q&A parts later on, because I'm sure you'll have some opinions on the questions. Hey, we're going to do 3 polls for everyone to get a sense of who's at least registered. We know many more people have logged in along the way. So if we can go to our first poll for the Cancer Foundation's team. So if you want to answer the poll, what's your primary role in attending today? We'll just take a minute here to get the poll results rolling in. If you have an other, we'll just have to get to that later on, but presumably you're in one of these categories. I'll rely on the council team if we're doing okay on results. Maybe we'll close out the poll. That should have been an easy one. All right, so there we go. Got a mix, great. And these pieces are primarily for private foundations. I'll talk about the relationships with some of the other organizations here in a second. Let's go to our next poll. So poll 2, we can move to that, is for the private foundations on the call especially, what is your typical payout rate? Set aside sort of what's going on this year, but what do you typically do? Is it 5-ish% or something larger than that? Take just a second. We know that we'll be talking about some of those ranges in the context in a minute, and the panelists will be weighing in too about their results. All right, let's see how the folks answered. 5-ish. All right, pretty common there, and that's pretty classic. Let's do one more poll. The last one is, if you are asked either internally or externally to spend more than 5-ish%, what challenges do you face? And you can pick all that apply. So no challenges, it's easy for you. Do you have somebody who shuts that conversation down pretty quickly? Is it about conflicts of goals and choices? Worry about your investment performance? There's some other concern. And certainly there's a lot of variation in these as well. We know that things get very, very complicated behind the scenes in boards and in their discussions with staff and advisors and the rest. All right, let's see how our results are. Worry about investment performance. That's especially true this year and in other years where the economy is not doing so great. But we'll bring some of those issues into our conversation in a couple minutes. Let me set some context. We can go back to the slides. Thanks, Manuela. So in late 2010, I was picked to manage an endowed family foundation started by this couple, Roy and Rachel Hunt. It was the Roy A. Hunt Foundation based in Pittsburgh with family members that gave across the United States. I had brought 18 years of experience in grant making and philanthropic advising to the family. What I didn't bring was a deep knowledge of fiduciary responsibility or the factors that can shape spending decisions or the range of choices my peers were making. Let's go to the next slide. The Council on Foundations, the National Center for Family Philanthropy know that many foundation staff and board members had the same gaps in their knowledge as they joined their own foundations or their other funds. And we know that you're especially struggling with spending decisions in years like 2020 when there are so many complicating factors. I'm thankful that they asked me to write these two guides to help foundations and donors make more informed decisions. The guides are free and available to the public and available on both of their websites. Just some notes, the guides are primarily written for US-based private foundations and the donors who establish them and the professionals who advise them. That said, other types of foundations and public charities can learn from a number of the frameworks in the guides and some of the thinking on investment governance. The strategy guide, the gray piece, features perspectives of more than a dozen private foundations and more than a dozen experts from the fields of investment and governance and philanthropy. The discussion guide, the white document, provides key questions and checklists and activities to help make your decision-making process a little easier, we hope. And as Nick said, we're inviting you to reflect deeply on your spending rates, especially if and when you might choose to spend more in times of crisis. But we leave the final answer to you and respect whatever choices you make in this diverse field of philanthropy. So let's go on. So there are four big ideas in the strategy guide, discussion guide. I'll cover those briefly. You'll get a chance to read more about them and hear more about them. So the first is reconsidering the factors that go into your spending decisions. Federal and state laws generally allow your foundation to take more than investment performance into account. Your role as a fiduciary also asks that your decisions reflect an understanding of your internal and external purposes, the conditions and trends that the communities and causes you support face, access to other resources, financial or otherwise, and more. You get to decide how you weight each of these factors, and you'll hear stories in today and in the discussion guide or strategy guide and how people weighted these in different ways. Next slide, please. The second big idea augments the first one, and that is how are you really thinking about approaching investment stewardship and your role as an investment steward? And we covered three big principles as we talked to folks. First is your fiduciary responsibility is for more than your investments. It's for your assets, it's for your mission, and for the causes and communities that you serve and care about. And all of those weigh in your fiduciary responsibility. Second is many foundations probably need to do some work strengthening the skills and confidence in their board members and staff members in investment governance, really understanding what your roles are in governing those assets, your fiduciary duty, and the ways that you can step up in and sort of take control over those roles. And lastly is strengthening the accountability and alignment of your investment advisor. You may find from time to time that your advisors aren't caught up with the way you're thinking about your fiduciary role or how you want to spend, and some foundations, including a couple we talked to for the guide, ended up changing advisors to find advisors that help match their current thinking. Next slide, please. The third big idea in the guides is some assumptions that you might want to challenge, your board members might want to challenge, you might challenge if you're a donor to a foundation, or even your advisors might challenge. The first is permanent endowment and the primacy of portfolio growth might not be mandatory. It's a common practice for sure, but it isn't always actually baked into legal documents or the founding documents of foundations. It was an assumption people made later on, and there's some language in the strategy guide that helps you understand that maybe those things aren't mandatory for you and you have some more flexibility. Second is the maybe now increasingly the myth that most endowed private foundations spend only 5%. It turns out that the majority of endowed private foundations spend more than 5%, even 6 to 8% on a regular basis. And so if you think it's 5% is really the norm, it hasn't been for a while. Third is in the long run, spending more might not damage intergenerational equity. There are arguments on both sides of this. I'm not a mathematician, and we can ask George Suttle some questions in a minute, but there are studies that say that if you really are around for the long term, if you really are thinking about perpetuity, time can heal all wounds, and various financial projections will say you can survive spending more for some number of years and still get through the long term. The other concept in that is intergenerational equity, sort of the idea of keeping the same level of assets over time doesn't just apply to assets. Intergenerational equity can also be about the impact and the kind of world you're leaving to future generations. And there's some language in the guides about that. Fourth big idea, next slide, is where do you land on a spectrum of options? We developed this graphic to help people understand that there are private foundations all across the spectrum of decisions, from on the left, people who maximize wealth and asset preservation, really try to sort of hold on to the assets over time, to those folks who maximize money out the door and all points in between. These are all equally valid solutions and answers to those questions of how much do we spend and how do we balance perpetuity and the rest. Next slide, please. The guide and today's conversation focus a lot in this middle ground. So first is what we would call the new norm. Again, the majority of private endowed foundations spend more than 5% regularly, and certainly the majority of them tend to spend more in times of crisis, while still willing to be perpetual and interested in growth in their endowment over time. Then we find this new, or maybe not so new, creative zone, the stories that weren't told as much of foundations that are really thinking more flexibly about investment growth and thinking about how they put their money to use to meet their mission. So they're really sort of purpose first and perpetuity and payout and sort of second orders of it. Some of them are staying with perpetuity. Some of them are meant to be long-term organizations, multiple generations, maybe perpetuity is a little bit flexible. And then some have flexible time horizons based on what they heard from their founders. Today's conversation and the strategy guide don't really dive into the foundations that are not permanent. So those who choose to be time limited or to be sort of pass through, we leave those for other webinars and guides. So this is really about those organizations that want to have a long time span and still play with how they're thinking about payout. So those are the big ideas in the strategy guide. The discussion guide helps you answer some of your own questions about these, and you're going to hear from our folks about how they've been answering some of these questions and how they think about those big issues. Next slide. We can bring our panelists in. I will introduce them and then we'll dive into a conversation about their thoughts. So next slide. Pete Bird is the CEO of the Frist Foundation, a family foundation based in Nashville. He joined the foundation as senior program officer in 1983 and became CEO in 2002. He was previously a journalist and a senior VP at a regional bank. He's been active in the public policy committees for the Southeastern Council on Foundations, the Council on Foundations, the Alliance for Charitable Reform. Liz Sack is the executive director of the Cricket Island Foundation, a family foundation based in New York City. She joined the foundation in 2008 after 2 decades of leading youth development, education, and community development work. She speaks and writes regularly on philanthropy topics. And then joining us last is George Suttle, the managing director and director of research at the Common Fund Institute. You may recognize that name as a partner to the Council and Foundations on the annual investment return survey. He was previously a program officer at 2 foundations, a VP at a national bank, and CSR manager at a large insurance company. He's on the board of the New York Foundation, which was interviewed for this strategy guide, and teaches at New York City. Behind the scenes, we've got Daniela Rodriguez-Ranf and Jen Creenel and Manuela from NCFP and Council on Foundations. They will be taking your questions and firing to the 4 of us and Nick later on. We also have Brian Del Rosario, who is helping answer any legal and technical questions behind the scenes. So you may get a note from him if you have something that's more technical. As a reminder, we'll send in your questions throughout the Q&A function, and we'll get to those later. So let's dive in, you all. We're going to take the last slide down, Manuela. We'll just go to the 4 of us. So we're going to start off with just some really, really brief backgrounds about your foundations, and in Georgia, in your case, the Common Fund Institute, just so people know a bit about it. So Liz, can we start with you? Just what's a brief overview on the Cricket Island Foundation?
Sure. Thank you, and thank you for having me today. I'm excited for the conversation. The Cricket Island Foundation was founded in 2000, the result of a sale of a family business. And the foundation was really started to replace the table that the family business had created for the 3 generations in the family. And the donor's intent was really that this would be a place to bring the family together around a shared purpose, around a shared mission, to work as a collective. And we have, I think, between 18 and 21 board members, I'm not sure right this minute, representing 3 generations of the family. Since I've been there in 2008, we've transitioned from being primarily 2nd generation heavy to sort of really now 50-50 mixed. And we're in the midst of our first leadership transition since the foundation was started in 2000. So we're going from a 2nd generation leader to a 3rd generation leader. We fund nationally, and we fund youth-led social change work through cohort models, and I'll leave it there.
Great, we'll get more into the details. Pete, tell us about the Frist Foundation.
Oh, sure. Thanks for having me, Tony. It's nice to be a part of this conversation, particularly at a time when this is in the forefront for a lot of people. We are, the Frist Foundation was established in 1982, and it's a family foundation. Has a small board of directors, 8 people, but 3 generations sit on that board of directors. And so I don't have to guess about founder intent, because founder is usually hovering right in the background and making himself heard. And we are a place-based grant maker in addition to being a family foundation. We are focused on the welfare and the quality of life here in Nashville, Tennessee. We make grants almost exclusively in Nashville, and we are have taken it upon ourselves as the largest foundation in the area to start and sustain a number of enduring entities, including the Community Foundation, our Center for Nonprofit Management. We gave founding grants to the Land Trust, to our Latinx Service Center, and a number of other organizations where that's our mission, is to support Nashville nonprofits and their infrastructure. And it's a stressful time to have that mission. I'll let it go back to you, Tony.
We'll come back to that. And then George, tell us a little bit about the Common Fund and Common Fund Institute for folks who don't know you.
Sure. Yeah. First and foremost, thanks for having me. Happy to be in community and fellowship with everyone. The Common Fund is an asset management firm that works firmly in the endowment space. We were founded in 1971, actually by the Ford Foundation. So we were seeded by a grant from the Ford Foundation with the explicit focus of working with nonprofits as institutional investors in the investment management space. And as a part of our legacy and connection to the Ford Foundation, we were given an explicit educational mandate to serve not only our clients, but also the industry more broadly. So the Common Fund Institute is the realization of that educational mandate. And so the Institute is the research, thought leadership, and education arm of the Common Fund. And so we're actually have a special nonprofit designation. So that really allows us to align with a lot of our nonprofits with the mission focus. So happy to be representing the firm.
Great, thank you. It's for all 4 of us and for the audience. Somebody asked a question about, when we talk about payout, do we mean including admin costs? And I think, yes, we're talking about all the stuff that gets paid out, whether it's admin or programs or grants. So we'll sort of keep that in mind as we're chatting along the way. George, let's start with you about this idea of stewardship and fiduciary responsibility. Sort of big terms, and they evolve over time. Give us a sense of how the Common Fund thinks about the modern roles of a fiduciary and investment steward. What should our attendees be taking back to their boards and staff?
Sure. So I think for us at Common Fund, so we understand sort of the definition of fiduciary responsibility, and of course we're sensitive to it because our nonprofit partners are doing their best to adhere to the definition. But over the last few years, we've really begun to reframe fiduciary responsibility as investment stewardship. We think that elevates and makes the goals of the nonprofit organization loftier, and it really allows us to be more multidimensional and holistic in our understanding of who are we actually responsible for, and what are we responsible for doing as fiduciaries, as trustees, and as boards of directors. So I really love that we're beginning to do that reframing, because it allows us to, as I said, have those multidimensional conversations and really bring in the myriad of considerations when we're making investment decisions.
And it gets back to those three core duties of any nonprofit board, right? Loyalty, obedience, and care. And that gets through the whole mission of an organization, not just the sort of financials that are sitting there, right?
Right. I mean, it's one of those things, and I'm amongst friends and family and peers in the space. So it's one of those things where if we expand our understanding of what it means to be an investment steward, then we begin to ask ourselves different questions. Are we an asset management firm that just happens to make grants? Or are we a strategic, mission-oriented, mission-focused nonprofit organization that really thinks strategically about deploying all of our resources in service to the communities and the communities that we care about? So if we're the former, then that's a different conversation. But if we really do believe we're the latter, then we need to take a more holistic approach in everything that we do.
Pete and then Liz, so how do your boards talk about stewardship and responsibility? Are taking bigger frameworks, or are there certain things from your founding documents that lead you to talk about stewardship in certain ways?
As I mentioned before, our founder is still around, so we don't have to reference documents. All we got to do is call him on his cell phone. And in terms of payout and responsibilities and what we shoot for, we have historically shot for that 5%, but we've been fortunate over the years, we've got almost 40 years of history, to have this foundation growing every year. So there has been an increasing payout in terms of millions of dollars. And our founder and our board want this foundation to be around for a long time, perpetuity ideally, but at the same time, from the very beginning, our foundation has not been afraid to extend beyond the 5% if circumstances warrant. And our founder has always asked a question. He asks it to this day, which is, if you had more money, what would you do with it? And if you come up with something good, come back to us. We'll always say yes.
That's a handy board member to have right there. Liz, talk about how your founder documents and sort of how the family is talking about this idea of stewardship of assets and mission and everything else.
Sure. Our founder, who is also still on the board, we have a similar situation to you, Pete. The foundation was really started to kind of teach the generations of the family about social responsibility and responsibilities of wealth and so on. And so when we talked about perpetuity, the conversation really became perpetuity for now. In other words, the second gen is very committed to their children participating in the foundation in some capacity, but I think they're all very open to, and we continue to revisit the idea of perpetuity as a collective to figure out whether it still makes sense for us to exist. And it's something I've appreciated, is an openness to that kind of questioning. George, I love what you were saying about how we think about fiduciary responsibility, and I think the second scenario you gave is very much how we approach it. Which is rather than think about 5% as a ceiling, we start our budgeting process with a floor for our grant-making budget, and then everything else is layered on top of it. So I think we've approached the sense of responsibility and investment responsibility around from a grantee-centered position. So we start with the floor of 4%, which can go up. And then we layer the administrative costs on top of that, so that we really try to think about our expenses in a way that maximize our impact. Again, recognizing that we're in a perpetuity frame right now, so we're not trying to spend, well over, up 7, 8, or 9%. But we are trying to make sure that our budgeting process maximizes what's going out to the field, as opposed to starting with our admin budget and then layering numbers on top to set us at a ceiling of 5.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, George. I would just jump in and say, and Pete alluded to this, I think when we consider perpetuity, we conflate our notion of that with infinity. So, I want to live a long time, but I understand that I will not live forever. So when I think about it, I always urge my colleagues to think about a perpetuity horizon. Do you have any sensibility of how long is a long time? 50 years, 75 years, 100 years, 150 years? And if you start to think about it that way, then you can start to, entertain intellectual exercises that allow you to do some scenario planning and some modeling, even if just for fun, right? Let's model it out for 100 years. Let's see what it would look like if we increased our spending to 7% for 100 years. What would that look like? And even if you ultimately decide to stay at 5% or 6%, at least you participated in that strategic governance exercise. It's good fiduciary hygiene.
Play along with that, George, and then maybe Pete and Liz. So people will also connect the term stewardship with legacy, right? And especially as you're thinking about longer term organizations, are your families talking about legacy in the same way that lots of foundations do, or do they see it in a different way because they're being more responsive to their communities? How do they talk about it?
Right. So Tony, for us, Common Fund, we squarely work in the institutional space. Right. But I'll put my in a past life, I was a philanthropic advisor on the private wealth side. So I'll wear both of those hats. Conversations about legacy, whether you're talking to a family or a board of trustees for a private or even a community foundation, it's really about, what do you mean by legacy? Do you want the institution? Do you want institutional legacy? Do you want to carve out an impact legacy? Do you want the name of the institution to last forever, or do you want the impact to last forever? And so we really need to understand the type of conversation around legacy we're having before we can move forward. So I always just offer that, to say that, a legacy of one's name and lineage is fine. And so if that is the primary goal, then that's a different conversation than having an impact legacy conversation. And maybe both are possible, then that's a third type of conversation. But I think we all want to get on the same page around, what type of legacy are we trying to preserve and propagate?
Yep. Liz, and then Pete, that idea of legacy, where are your forwards on that spectrum of sort of institutional legacy, impact legacy?
Yep. Well, it's funny because when I took the job, when I was being interviewed for the job, it was the question I actually interviewed with each of the family members individually. And it was the first question I had for the founders was, what is the legacy you want to leave? And I feel like every time we're at one of these decision points, whether it's about our spending or about a grant making strategy, we are continually asking this question of legacy so that there is intention around whatever it is that we're doing, because however you show up in the field is part of that. And the family's been very clear that the legacy for them isn't about name, it is about impact, it's about relationships, and it's about being in community and in partnerships. And that has been the driver. And when we moved our finance manual, when we were just to bring this back to spending conversations, part of the reason we wanted to have some of our values in the finance manual was because that legacy is important, that we're institutionalizing the practice of centering grantees in our spending decisions and in our grant making practices and in the other ways that we're working. And so the legacy conversation has been important. And to go back to George, I thought what you were saying about perpetuity is exactly right. that's part of the conversation around legacy. Perpetuity is part of that, and it is talked about in philanthropy like it's an always decision, and it is for a moment, it is for a horizon, and I think it's important that we are all open to thinking about it in that way, as opposed to it being the end of a conversation.
Pete?
We got good news on legacy. We've been building it all along, and we really don't consider our foundation, the Frist Foundation, the legacy. It's really the work that we've done and the institutions that we've created along. And so we've been building our legacy really for 40 years. And, you know, we were one of the key founders of our community foundation here in Nashville, which is now 30 years old. And we started our downtown art center, the Frist Art Museum, which is, you know, a terrific legacy for the community. We started a nonprofit management service center for the city that's been around 30 years. And we're thinking about legacy all the time, but we're not thinking of it in terms of piling up money and anointing that with the Frist Foundation name. It's what the money can do. That's the legacy.
Does that show, Liz mentioned, you know, sort of in making some of those values into their financial policy. So have you embedded some of that into how you think about your investment policy, your spending policy, how you talk to your investment advisors, your tax advisors, sort of how does it show up in the documentation and processes?
Well, you know, our question is, what do we have the money to do what we see as the opportunity? And that's our conversation with the investment advisors. And for example, we think we have one of the opportunity to build one of the great zoos in America, in Nashville. Anybody who knows anything about zoos know they're terribly expensive. And some people might even call them black holes, but we don't consider it like that. We consider that part of our legacy. But we're talking in the range of $35 to $50 million right now that we're trying to pay in to build out one of the great zoos in America. And so this is the way we think, and the way we've always thought as time has unfolded is, where are the opportunities today to serve this community better? And then how can we have enough money to ensure that those institutions will endure?
And so does that translate that into a spending policy that sort of meets the opportunity based on what you've dived into over time? Or is it sort of, how do you balance those like big projects you're working on with different needs?
We've been fortunate to have a growing investment base. And we started out with $25 million. Now we have more than $400 million. And what that's allowed us to do is, as we start things, we can sustain them. We started an art museum in downtown Nashville that has a $12 million annual budget. Half that budget comes from us. That's, you know, part of the legacy is essentially our part of our endowment, part of our investment portfolio is dedicated to sustaining those things that we started.
So let's stay with you there for one more minute, Pete. So you've got this sort of idea of spending 5%-ish. Sounds right. You go higher than that in some opportunities. When does your board get most excited about spending more than 5%? And when do they get itchy to say, no, we better stick to the sort of basic 5-ish%? What sort of drives their thinking?
Well, we do what we have to do to sustain certain institutions. And I'll give you an example. In 2001, our portfolio crashed, the market crashed. We still had an obligation that year of subsidizing a brand new art museum to the tune of $8 million. Now, do the math. You've got a portfolio, it's about $100 million, and you've got a 5% payout, and where you're paying out $8 million to a single institution, and you've got ongoing baggage. Every foundation has ongoing baggage. These are commitments that you tend to renew every year. And at that point, our board said, there's not any question. We're going to do what we have to do. And if that means falling on our sword to sustain this brand new art museum, we'll do it. And that became the priority, not sustaining the foundation. It was about sustaining the work and the institution, in essence, the legacy that we created outside the envelope of the foundation.
So in that case, payout follows purpose. You have a purpose sustaining and building these organizations, and perpetuity is still there, but maybe the sort of level of assets might be variable over time.
Absolutely, and we worry about that same thing right now as we stand 6 months into the pandemic, staring down this dark canyon of when is it going to be solved, how deeply are our nonprofit agencies going to suffer, and what happens when donor fatigue sets in, and what happens when net revenues get disrupted. At that point, we're going to be prepared to jump in and sacrifice ourselves as we try and sustain those nonprofit agencies in Nashville.
So Liz, let's start with the normal times. You said you know sort of leading with this grantee-centric philosophy of spending and payout. So talk about, like, when does the board get excited about spending more than 5%? And when do they get itchy, my term, for spending around 5%? Sort of what drives that tension?
Well, so we use a 12-quarter trailing average to do our budgeting, and I think one of the reasons we've done it is so that it cuts down on the reactiveness that folks have to market fluctuations, and so our investment policy, our investment manual has, and our spending policies have floors and ceilings in them that provide some opportunity to increase our expenses. But when we talk about decreasing them, it sets a floor that is still, again, with the minimum of the grantees getting 4%. So that, again, cuts down on how reactive we can be on the low end. And then in terms of spending more, I think it's, it's opportunities. It's when we're hearing things from our grantees that are getting folks excited, and it's moments like this when you're heading into an election, when you're dealing with a pandemic, when there's real urgency coming from the grantees and from our partners around increasing spending. So, but I think, again, part of the reason for us to have the finance manual is to enable us to cut down on the highs and lows, right? To make sure that we're not getting too reactive in either direction. In 2008, when the market crashed, a lot of folks in the short term made decisions to increase their spending, in 2008, 2009, and then you saw spending go in the opposite direction a couple of years later, particularly smaller foundations. And so, when we talked about it at the beginning of the pandemic, our board was saying, listen, we don't want to, if we're going to give more now, we need to be comfortable with our endowment going lower because we don't want to give less later. So I think we're constantly operating in the short term and the long term together, so that we're making sure, again, we're not sort of taking our grantees on rides where our distributions are going all over the place. And I think that's been incredibly helpful for our grantee partners, as well as for the board. And in the short term, just for right now, one of the things we did was to move a lot of our administrative expenses over to program for this year. So when we knew that we weren't going to be, we put a bunch of money aside for grantee gatherings and other admin costs. We pushed that very early on over to our grant making budget to enable us to give more for this particular year, and I suspect it'll roll over into 2021, or maybe it won't. We can all hope we'll travel again one day. But I think we try to find flexibility within the constraints of our budget.
George, go ahead, George.
Yeah, Tony, I would just share that, at Common Fund, what's really interesting for us is that, since we're a mission-focused asset manager, we never take mission off the table. So for us, we understand that our institutions are going to want to respond and meet the moment. And so for us, we think about, well, how can we manage the risk and help our clients recover more quickly? So we don't necessarily think about, oh, asset values down, what do we need to do? We say, okay, we understand you're going to lean into your mission. How can we help you recover more quickly? Because we understand you're playing the long game. So I think that drawdown recovery viewpoint is fascinating, and I know it's been incredibly helpful to a lot of our clients. So just another perspective and a way to think about, well, we know you're going to lean into mission. We're a partner with you. So let's really think about another framework. Let's think about how we get you back to normal spending rates as quickly as possible.
George, you heard from both Liz and Pete, two foundations that are open to being flexible about payout. They're sort of thinking 5% doesn't have to be the only answer. We could do something different over time. At the same time, there are a number of foundations who have people who are internally worried, or even advisors that tell them, like, gosh, if you spend more than 5%, you aren't actually endowed. You're invading principle, and so you're somehow being sacrificial to a goal. How do you all talk with funders or board members about that to say, look, spending more than 5% can still get you to perpetuity, or can still be a way to honor endowment and intergenerational equity and all the rest of it?
Well, it's interesting. Thanks for that question, Tony. And we touched on it a little bit earlier on. Is that for us, we encourage boards of trustees, especially for private foundations, to go back to their governing documents. Let's do a strategic review. Are you a true endowment in the truest sense of the definition? Is it permanently restricted? Is there a donor stipulation that says that this corpus is to be invested into perpetuity, and there's no flexibility around that? And you'd be surprised. When we do that strategic review, it's like, oh, actually, you've just been culturally, as a board culture and an organizational culture, been treating this as a proper endowment, when in actuality, there's some flexibility there. And so now that really opens up a different type of conversation. So it really is this holistic approach. And I think for us, it's really about trying to stay objective and agnostic about the board's goals. So we would never say, right, you guys really should, not only, exist forever, but keep us as a client forever too, right? It's like, no, what are you trying to accomplish? What are your values? What's your mission? Let us model out scenarios so that you can have robust strategic governance conversations. So, we're really saying, let's put everything on the table. Let's be smart. Let's be partners on this. Let's ask ourselves hard questions and really figure out how we can work together.
We're going to get to Q&A in a minute. We've got some questions that the team's feeding me. We're going to bring Nick in, but let's complete the story for 2020, at least for Liz and Pete. Pete, you leaned in a little bit already that you said you've got some grantees that you're really concerned about. You may be willing to, I forget your phrase, but sort of go over the cliff with them. So what was your foundation's response in 2020, and sort of what drove that decision making? Maybe just a couple minutes to give us a hint.
When we were sitting in March, early April, like everyone, we didn't know what bottom was for our investment portfolio. And but we also knew that hard times were coming for our grantees. And so one thing we did was adjust our budget. We had a very large grantee. I've talked about the Nashville Zoo. $5 million, what we were due to pay them this year. We told them, you're not going to get paid this year. We're putting $5 million, all of a sudden went back into our flexible grant making budget. So that bumped up our budget quite a bit to be prepared to react to whatever came up. And as it turned out, there we were, locked and loaded, money ready to come in and rescue Nashville's nonprofit community. And the federal response came. and it was awesome, and it was huge, and it was temporary. Now looking back on this, so as it turned out, we've only made 2 big grant distributions during the pandemic. One was on the early end, we helped more than 100 organizations transition to remote working. We gave them grant money to help them buy the tools to work remotely. The other grant distribution we made was just last month in August. We had seen the 30 organizations we were very concerned about as kind of core to Nashville's nonprofit health and the health of the community. Almost universally, everybody working for these organizations was burning out. And so what we did is we gave grants. We didn't require that they ask. We just gave grants to all 30 of these organizations to do something nice for their employees in terms of self-care, counseling, home delivered meals, whatever it took to make these nonprofit employees feel appreciated and to give them the gasoline they needed to go a little further, because nobody expected pandemic to last this long. And here we are once again finding ourselves locked and loaded. We have plenty of money and we're ready to give it to nonprofits, but between PPP money and reserves, our agencies are in good shape overall.
That's good.
But we're very worried about them as we get into the fall and the winter. And I think the pandemic is going to last a lot longer than people think.
We have a number of nonprofits that I think are tuned into this webinar. They'll be moving their offices to Nashville to take advantage of your grantee-centric approach. Liz, so your foundation's reaction to 2020, you've already been very grantee-centric. So what was your answer in terms of spending and sort of response?
Well, as I mentioned, we moved a bunch of admin money over. We're increasing our payout a bit. I think the other things that we did, which were easy, were we just got rid of all of our reporting requirements. We had some specific small grants that we just moved that money over into general operating support. We're giving each of our grantees an additional general operating support grant. And we repurposed some funds for rapid response. Like Pete, we also very early on paid for all of our grantees to move their work to remote. So I think what I think we realized, and I think what most of us in philanthropy are realizing, is that there are answers financially. Like there are things, if you can find more money, that's great. If your budgets will enable you to have some flexibility, or you can increase your payout. But there are, when you talk about legacy and you talk about impact, you can create impact without money. And so things like loosening restrictions or rethinking about grant requirements and so on and so forth are equally impactful. I mean, they're not as impactful as grants, but they are helpful. And we have a couple of grantees that one who's already told us that they're closing, and we have a couple of others that have indicated that they may be closing. And those folks we're going to continue to fund through whatever the transition is, whether they end up merging, whether they end up closing, or whatever it might be. I mean, it's been an interesting moment, right? Because the market hasn't been. This is in 2008, and so it's sort of easy for a lot of us to feel like super generous right now, because we're not faced with 2008 where the market was crashing. The market has actually been. It's been certainly uncertain, but it's recovered. So the question to me is that, we all, I think, would agree that there's some correction that's coming. I don't know when, but what happens then? I mean, I think to me, this is a moment to figure out to start asking and planning around the longer term questions. As Pete mentioned, this is likely the pandemic and the crisis that's happening in communities isn't going to go anytime soon, but the market may correct, and we may start seeing less positive returns. And what are we all thinking about doing then? Because I think that's equally as important.
We promise not to make George give us economic forecasts or investment forecasts, so we'll leave that for your own investment advisors. Nick Tedesco, can we bring you into the conversation? We'll do some answering of some of the questions that have been coming in before and afterwards. Maybe for Nick and George first, a couple of questions have been coming in about just like, our board members may not all see eye to eye on this. Some of them may be very traditional in their sense of we need to stick to 5% or else, and others saying we were trying to meet the times, we were trying to meet the demands of today and do right by our organization, be purpose first. So any suggestions from the two of you on how foundations can navigate those conversations and help build consensus, or what kinds of tools they can use, or what kinds of information they should have?
Nick, I can jump in. I'd say, what's been really helpful is, use the strategic guide, that we worked on for the last few months. There are frameworks for thinking about a multitude of strategic inputs when you're thinking about payouts, perpetuity, legacy, and permanence. A good friend and colleague of mine, Dimple Abachandandi, really does a really good job of creating a balancing test framework that allows for strategic governance conversations about all of the inputs that boards of trustees should be considering. So so I think frameworks like that and others where you're just having values-based conversations really expand the conversation and the understanding of what it means to be an investment steward.
Yeah, I would just add on to that. I'd echo what George said. I think it's about conversation, and it's about conversations rooted in values. I think external advisors, partners, are often helpful to talk to each of the family members to see where there are points of agreement or where there are a divergence of opinions, and to have that conversation honestly about, why are we looking at kind of our spend rate in a certain construct, and what is potentially holding us back from exploring other options, right? And some of this is also debunking some myths, right? If we go beyond 5%, then we are a limited life entity, right? And we know, and we brought this to life in the paper, that that's not the case, right? And so some of this is just facilitating a really honest conversation about some fears that might be holding you back, looking at patterns of behavior that maybe need to be revisited, and having a really honest reflection on why you choose to look at the construct of payout in a certain way. And a healthy dialogue across family members is extremely productive and will ultimately drive a conversation forward or affirm a position you're holding.
And for all of you, there's a couple questions before and during. So a number of folks are also thinking about like, how does impact investing or ESG or mission aligned investing sort of play out in this as you're thinking about balancing purpose and perpetuity and payout? So maybe George, start with you, and then Pete and Liz. How are people sort of thinking about impact investing as a tool to forward their missions in these kinds of balancing acts?
Yeah, I think impact investing in ESG is a nice way to express philanthropic values without necessarily spending money, right? So there's this, philosophical conversation about, pulling all the levers and strategically deploying all of a foundation's assets, in service of mission. And I think impact investing and ESG investing is a great way to do that, right? You can strategically, through your investment portfolio, you can strategically deploy resources to communities that you care about, and it actually can help you grow your assets. That's a win-win proposition, and it really does behoove us as trustees to work with our investment advisors, consultants, and partners to bring us those opportunities as well.
Yeah, the one thing I might jump in, Tony, on that is, I would encourage people to not just look at their assets in silos, right? And, look at, not just what are we doing with our tax exempt assets, but what are we doing in the taxable portfolio, right? This notion of social impact is all inclusive, right? And the only way that we're really going to make meaningful and enduring change is to start to break down these silos. And so what I would ask people to reflect on this call as well is, are you talking to your financial advisor not just about the endowment, but are you talking about how you're putting to work your assets in other pools of capital as well?
My experience with this, I absolutely love the idea of impact investing. The problem you have if you are a place-based grant maker and you have a board of directors that says, let's try and minimize admin expense, and that's us. We're running at 0.25% for our admin expense. We have 3 full-time staff people. If you're serious about impact investing, hire somebody. Make them wear that hat. Make them wake up every morning thinking about impact investing. And you also have to be aware and be out fishing all the time for where's the impact in Nashville? Where's the impact in your place? Very easy to throw money into a national pool and feel noble because it's ESG oriented. But is that really going to help your community? That's the barrier we've had, is both staffing and deal flow locally to impact investing.
Liz, your board been thinking about that?
It is something we've been thinking about, and I think it's something, it's definitely been some challenging conversations, but it's something we do have a small amount of our portfolio working in that way, but it is something that the board continues to work through.
We've had a couple of questions again before and during this call about sort of how do you sort through the roles of where does the board make these decisions? Where does the finance committee or investment committee make the decisions? Where does staff get to play in the decisions? So maybe Nick and George start from the top level about sort of what's a good practice or best practice. And then Pete and Libby, you can say practically, how do you sort of balance the different actors in this decision making around payout and permanence?
George, happy to have you jump in.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it definitely is best practice for a lion's share of the work to be done in committee. But I think what ends up happening is that, the larger board might defer to its investment committee, and because, by default, you put all of the investment or investment adjacent people on that committee. So the larger board's deferring to the investment committee, and maybe the investment committee to a large extent is deferring to the financial advisor or the investment, the investment advisor. So what I encourage is that the investment committees can still own the scope of work, but their process should be inclusive of all stakeholders, other committees, the board overall, and the financial advisor. We have to stay vigilant, stay strategic, stay engaged at every level. Because what I always say is, and I work at an asset management firm, is that at the end of the day, you want it to be a strategic partnership with your asset manager. But it's also a transactional relationship. So defer appropriately, but also push for what you want and how you want to express your philanthropic advisors through your, how you want to express your philanthropic values with your investment portfolio. Tell them what you want because you're paying them.
That makes sense.
I would add that exactly what George said. 2 points here. One is set the vision at the all board level, right? So really understand here, across all directors, why you're doing this work, the purpose behind why you're doing this work, and then the tools that you want to bring forward to carry this vision forward. And then when you look at the work being done in committees, it's very much to make sure that you're advancing this in the way that's appropriate, and that that you're managing your fiduciary responsibility accordingly. But I think that this goes back to, again, tying your investment strategy to purpose, and purpose is an all board conversation. And it's not just a conversation that happens once. It's a conversation that is continuously reflected upon. and that advances over time, right? And so, far too often you'll see that, the investments are siloed to a committee discussion. But, tying it back to an all director discussion on purpose and checking in on that and saying, do the means meet the end rather than, vice versa, just to check in and make sure we're doing the right thing is an important thing to do.
So Liz, in that sort of setting of spending policy and everything else, who makes the decisions where?
I mean, it's interesting. I think what Nick and George both said is exactly right, which is that it is work that happens in committee, but I think the challenge is in connecting the finance committee and getting it out of that silo. And so how do you make better connections between your finance and grant making? How do you make sure that your finance committee is embracing the values of the foundation, that it's not just sort of standing alone making financial decisions? A lot of what we're talking about here is what do we think about when we think about this responsibility, this fiduciary responsibility, and it being more than just managing the money. And so it's interesting on our board, I've actually been having conversations with a bunch of our grant making committee members to encourage them to actually get on the finance committee, because there's been this real sense, remember this is all family members, that it's this thing that happens over there. And what I've been saying to them is, listen, a lot of our values show up in the finance committee's work. I mean, our spending policy reflects our values. Our decisions on our investments reflects our values. So I think it's really, really important, and it is important that the committees talk to each other, that the whole board holistically understands and is engaged and knows what's going on. And George, you referenced the work Dimple's done with GSA, and I think she's totally right that it's important that the full board talks about all the factors that go into your spending decision. It might be that the finance committee takes that information and makes a final decision, but they need to understand how the board is looking at each of those different pieces of that responsibility and how they value it, so that they can make a decision that's reflective of the foundation as a whole.
For us, this is not hard stuff. We have an 8-member board. We talk about this all the time. Purpose, payout, balancing the two. And this doesn't become a difficult conversation until there's a crunch time. And a crunch time is when your portfolio is crashing. And for better or worse, I've been at the foundation almost its entire history, 40 years. And crunch time came in 1987, 2001, 2008. That's when our portfolio, really crashed, not down 10%, but down 50%. And at that point, it's a moment of truth where you have to say, why are we here? Why do we exist? Do we exist to hunker down and dig our way into a fallout shelter and save our own skins? Or do we do what we have to do as a community institution that people have come to count on? That's what we do. And fortunately, on each of these crunch times, there has been a happy outcome. The portfolio has recovered. We've done okay. And I don't know if 2020 is going to be a crunch time.
Yeah.
In April, I thought it was. Now I'm not so sure. I find myself scratching my head every day and saying, why in the heck is the S&P hitting a new high when we're looking at very bleak circumstances for the country in terms of businesses, unemployment, all the indicators of economic health or not are flashing red.
Yep.
And so I'm worried that once again, we will have to have that difficult conversation involving all the board about, okay, we don't have as much money. Are we going to have as much passion?
And the strategy guide has stories of foundations, and a lot of them talked about we've been through the recession and we saw a lot of people flash in the pan, lots of money, and then pull back. Liz, you mentioned this. And so lots of them are saying we are also trying to figure out, like, when do we keep some powder dry now, because we know that things are going to fall apart for the nonprofits over a longer period, even if the stock market comes back or the pandemic may have knock-on effects that we don't even know about yet. And so a lot of foundations are saying, yeah, we want to spend more, but we're going to hold out because we know stuff could get worse or at least stay pretty queasy. I think that's back to putting purpose first and understanding the surrounding environment, back to those 4 criteria that in that first graphic. Brian Del Rosario popped in from the Council on Foundations and it said, sort of distilled what you all were talking about. At the end of the day, the board of directors has the duty of care, even though that duty can be deferred to the committees. And ultimately, if the foundation's ever questioned, should that ever happen, the board has to say, we knew what was going on and here's why we made these decisions. It's not about which decisions they made. The regulators probably do not care unless you're violating some kind of law. It's more about, we knew that we took all of these factors into place, we played it all out, and we made this choice, 5%, 7%, 12%, 20%, whatever the case may be, as long as you can document the decision making, the factors that went into it. Question about for anybody sort of, and I know the Council of Foundations has a webinar coming up on this, but there's also people who've been throwing some very creative ideas at this in terms of 3 or 4 foundations that have done social impact bonds to help build their payout rate. And anybody have some thoughts about that as a new solution and how useful that is for small and mid-sized foundations?
I think it's useless for small and mid-sized foundations. You gotta wear long pants and be one of the big boys to do that stuff. This is high finance, and unless Goldman's willing to work with us and stitch together a number of smaller and mid-sized foundations and offer that service, and it's tricky. I admire the Ford Foundation and the others for taking that move, given who they are and the leadership role they play and the kind of grants they make. It's exactly the right thing to do.
George or Nick, you had anybody sending you in questions to say, gosh, we want to think about this too?
Yeah, I would just reiterate that, we're grateful for the leadership of, Darren Walker at Ford and the bigger foundation players. But they have the scale, and they have the ability to leverage investment and financing vehicles that the mid-sized and small foundations don't necessarily have access to, or it just doesn't make sense to pursue that type of strategy. So we're grateful for their leadership, but really looking for, creative opportunities at the small and mid-sized level.
And there's the simpler solution, right, Nick? A number of family foundations who've opened up lines of credit to say we can tap that line of credit as a way to pitch in, and that's a much easier thing to do than a social impact bond. And there were a couple of stories of foundations that are saying, well, in good times, we're going to set some of that money aside and sort of use it as a reserve for the down times. We can either think about it sort of within our own investment structure, we could park it in a donor advised fund, or use it somehow, and so they help smooth funding that way. So there might be other ways that are less complicated than doing a whole social impact bond and still get to that. We've got access to money from other sources.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I mean, I think it's about thinking creatively and understanding kind of the opportunities that you can pursue given the size and the scale, and also the staff that you have.
Great. For foundations that are really, dedicated to perpetuity, but are starting to ask some good questions. Maybe they are interested in the strategy paper and the session guide, what you all have to say. What advice do you all have for helping lead those conversations? What's a way to make sure the conversation goes well at the board level or at the family level? Liz, let me start with you. Sort of what's been some tips for you to help make sure the families all talking well together around something as this complex and especially challenging in these times?
I mean, I think starting from a values conversation, I think when you start with the money, it's very difficult. First of all, it's alienating to folks who don't feel comfortable with the money. And it's not really, to what Nick and George and everyone said, it's not putting your purpose and your mission at the center, right? So if you start with conversations around values, then your spending policies and all of those things will follow. I mean, they need to fit into that frame. And I guess the other thing is, you know, there's moments like this when the market's doing well and there's a lot of need. We see a lot of surge funding, and then on the other side, when the market drops, everything pulls back. I think the other thing is to try to find ways to put some guardrails up so that in those moments, the decisions aren't only emotional. Because an emotional decision in a moment, you know, whether it's surge funding or cutting back funding on the other end, may not be aligned with what your longer term values are. You know, your values are your values, and they need to, you know, if they're, whether your horizon, George, you talked really wisely earlier about just what your horizons are. And if you're, you know, you're operating at a 10-year horizon, how do you show up in that 10 years? Not right this second when it's up or the market's down, but what does it look like for you to show up and have impact over the 10 years? So I think those two pieces would be most important. And again, the first one being really just, again, starting with the values and making sure you're engaging the broader board in those conversations.
Really briefly for the rest of you, a couple sentences.
I think the time to talk about a sprinkler system is before the house is on fire. And I think you need to have conversations all the time about what happened, looking back at your history as a foundation, and how did you rise to the occasion when there was tremendous community need and maybe doubts about perpetuity, and, you know, the investments were headed in the wrong direction. And the fact that you've come out of that and you've got a story to tell, and it's a story about purpose and the foundation fulfilling its values, again, a word that people have used several times, I think that gets the mindset to be ready when crunch time comes.
Great. George?
Yeah, I would just, you know, reiterate what my colleague shared, you know, stay focused on mission, right? Really continue to evaluate what's important and what your role is as an investment steward, right? You're stewarding the mission, you know, and that involves a multitude of stakeholders. And so, yeah, and a multitude of strategic inputs that you need to consider. And so I think when you're thinking strategically, it really does allow folks to take the emotions out of it. So,
Nick, we'll give you the last word on that one. Advice for boards as they're chatting about these tough issues.
Yeah, I would expand upon what everyone said around staying focused on mission, but I would say look at mission in a much more, you know, deep way. So we here at NCFP talk about how family philanthropy often is comprised of a dual mission, an internal mission, the mission of the family, and an external mission, a mission of social impact. And my advice to families is to reflect on how both of those missions are being served by the current timeline of the foundation, and is one of those missions overriding the considerations of the other, and how do you balance the two?
Great. Thank you, all five of you, for jumping in. We have at least a couple dozen questions we weren't able to get to. For those of you who are listening as attendees, we're going to try to work on an FAQ to follow up from this for questions we could not get to. Our friends at Council on Foundations have been answering some things behind the scenes, and we'll engage our speakers in that. There's some upcoming programs we want you all to know about. Council on Foundations has their HR retreat next week, and they're diving in especially with their friends at Change Philanthropy on issues of equity and diversity and remote work. They have a webinar coming up on September 17th for expanding payout through debt financing. So if you want to get nerdy with the Ford Foundation, there's your chance. On the next slide, the National Center for Family Philanthropy also has a couple of good programs. If you have new trustees or trustees that want to be reminded about their stewardship and governance responsibilities, the 2020 Trustee Education Institute's a great way to reground yourself in all of the ways it means to be a good trustee and board member. And for those foundations who are interested in spending down or curious about that, a retreat's coming up in October, sponsored by the SD Bechtel Foundation and part of a long series of conversations the NCFP has been sponsoring on spend down and time-limited philanthropy. For those of you who are listening, also make sure you download the strategy guide and download the discussion guide. There are a lot of questions that are answered in those that we couldn't get to today, and give you some great tools for chatting about how all this works at your foundation. We'd love to hear from you. If you are putting those guides to use, please email us, please tweet us, please send us messages on LinkedIn or all the rest of it, and let us know how you're using the guides and what we can do to expand on the ideas. Lastly, we know there's going to be a survey coming out. We hope you give us some suggestions on what else you'd love to learn about this topic or other topics before you wrap up for today. And again, my thanks to George and Liz and Pete for their willingness to share their perspectives on payout and perpetuity and purpose. And my thanks to the Council on and the National Center for Family Philanthropy for asking me to write the new guides and host the webinar. We'll conclude today's webinar. We hope you all have a healthy and safe Labor Day weekend, at least here in the United States, and a great start to the fall. Bye, everybody. Thanks again.
Thank you, Tony.
Everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.